Midday concerning security outlook in our region. We had a speech yesterday from the Chinese ambassador here in Canberra. It was forthright. It's been described by my last guest as one with a silver tongue, but containing plenty of malice as well. Joining me live is Greens leader Adam Bandt for more on this and also the big climate issue of last week. Thanks very much for your time. A lot of analysis on this speech. What did you make of it?
Look, we've been concerned for some time about rising tensions between the US and China in our region. It has the potential not only to cause significant conflict and concern in the region, but also especially for Australia. I mean, Australia has got a lot to lose, as does the world, but Australia especially, if there is conflict between the US and China. And we've, for some time, been concerned that there hasn't been a strategy towards de-escalation. I noticed that recently the Australian government has started talking more about de-escalation. I noticed the Japanese ambassador, I think yesterday on your show or your network, was saying, talking in similar terms. That, we think, is the right approach, because conflict between these two superpowers would not only be devastating for Australia and the world, but as commentators have pointed out, these are nuclear-armed superpowers, and it is something we should be doing everything we possibly can to avoid.
I think just about everyone would agree with you on that. That's the ideal path. But is it also important to note where the unjustified aggression is coming from? On one hand, we had the US Speaker, not actually a government representative, but the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, merely visit Taiwan, and the reaction was large-scale military exercises, I should say, around the Taiwanese island. I mean, the outlier there is the Chinese government aggression, is it not?
Well, look, the US, how the US wants to conduct its foreign policy and manage its relationship with China is obviously a matter for them. But I do come back to the point that Australia has an interest in seeing that relationship managed well. And not only for Australia's domestic security interests and our own national security, but also because the big challenges that the world is facing, including the climate crisis, are going to require both the United States and China if we're to solve them. And read some reports that suggest that following this, that there's also talks about China now potentially suspending its cooperation on climate issues. This is why Australia should play a role together with other powers, but as Australia, as a country that has a relationship both with the United States and China, is in a good position, working together with other countries to de-escalate and to ensure that there is a strategy for de-escalation. And that, I think, is where we should be putting our efforts.
Right, but just to cut to your view on this, are you saying you see the US and China as equally to blame for the ratcheting up of tensions around Taiwan?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that they are both significant powers with whom Australia has a relationship. They're superpowers and they're nuclear-armed superpowers. I'm saying in this, Australia has to look out for its own interests, and Australia's interests have to be put first when considering what is our appropriate intervention. And that's where I say a strategy of de-escalation is not only in the world's interest, it's in Australia's interest.
What the two major parties here have agreed on is that China's the one in recent years that has been changing, upping its aggression, claiming these artificial islands in the South China Sea, militarising them when they said they wouldn't. Now the indication of using force to take Taiwan. Do you agree that it's the Chinese government aggression that's become the concern in our region?
Look, for a long time, it was only the Greens who were raising concerns about the human rights approach of the Chinese government, and like always drawing a distinction, which other parties haven't, between the Chinese government and the Chinese people. But with respect to Tibet, for example, it was Australia for a long time that was raising concerns about the approach of the Chinese government. And while the mining boom was on, we couldn't get anyone else to pay any attention to it. And while the money was rolling in, both Liberal and Labor were quite happy to not address these issues that we see as being fundamental. So we've always taken a pretty clear approach.
Yeah, that's a fair point on
human rights and Australia's interests need to be at the forefront of foreign policy.
on the security element, and you're just as forthright on the Chinese military aggression as you were on the human rights issue.
I can't be clearer. Like we are very concerned about this escalation, not only because of what it means in the region, but also potentially because of what it means for Australia. So, of course, we share the concern about rising tensions, and this is where the question is where I guess we take a different approach to Peter Dutton, whose approach is much more belligerent and is we think about potentially escalating conflict, and we shouldn't be contributing towards that. We should be contributing to de-escalating it.
All right, I want to ask you about climate as well. Of course, the Greens are helping Labor pass the 43% emissions reduction bill. What's been the feedback from some of your members?
Look, I think across the country, people want to see real climate action, and that's what we want to see too. We took a weak bill and we improved it to the point where we felt prepared to pass it. The feedback is generally, and I think since the election as well, relief that there's not overt climate deniers in charge and running our government. And there is a sense that in this parliament where we've got more third voices in it than ever, that there is the prospect of tackling some of the big issues that we're facing, and that this is a small step on the road to doing that. The great concern that we've had during the discussions and during the negotiations, which is also I found reflected back afterwards, as I've spoken to people afterwards, is that people are pleased that we're taking a small step along the road, but stunned that there's still new coal and gas projects that are potentially going to get approved. And I see today in the financial review, there's talk of a new gas expansion project that seems to have the full-throated backing of the Labor government. And like at some point, the massive dissonance between saying on the one hand, Parliament has to take climate action, but then on the other hand, the Labor government is going to keep opening up new gas and coal projects is going to hit home. And I would suggest people already see those two things. People are seeing those two as completely incongruous, and it's ultimately not a tenable position for the government.
So the issue there, though, is we know what the Greens want to do in the short, medium and longer term, but what can happen in the very short term? Even if that transition is starting now, we're facing a gas shortage next year. We still need gas next year. Do you agree that we need to be able to source that gas, heat people's homes, provide energy next year, even if you want the transition to happen a lot quicker? Because we're facing a shortage. That could mean spiralling costs, and people who could least afford it will be paying those costs.
Well, I'd say a number of things. One is we're trying to address a problem around the climate crisis, and you don't make it worse by opening new projects. Second, like anyone, even people who think that there is some role in the transition for gas, even they make it crystal clear that we've got enough gas in the system already to do that. We don't need to be opening up new projects to assist with that. Thirdly, businesses and households, the cost is going to keep going up and up and up, and this is the thing that the government isn't saying, is that even if they make additional supply available, which is not clear that this supply will be available for Australian households and businesses, even if they make it available, people are going to have to pay the international price. So what we can do in the short term, and what we're calling on the government to do in this coming budget, is to include subsidies and support to help households and businesses get off expensive gas. And the last point that I want to make about that is that there's plenty of gas in Australia. It's just all going overseas, and it's going overseas with these big corporations, in many instances not even paying for the gas in the first place and not even paying any tax on it. So this idea that there's somehow not enough in Australia to meet the needs now as we transition towards to zero emissions and 100% renewables is completely wrong.
Got to leave it there. Greens leader Adam Bandt, thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Tom.